just so you know. So I have a YouTube channel which I will post in the Slack as well. I keep coming in and out of the dark, sorry, by the sun is changing here. All right, upcoming sessions. Like I said, I'm building a question bank, so please feel free to send me questions that you're working on during the week that you found interesting or challenging, and I'm happy to do them in a session and work on them as a group. There's also 2 sessions left for this year. We're going to have our last session on December 8th, just as everyone's winding down over the Christmas break, but the Slack channel is always open, so please feel free to keep participating and sharing problems and chatting. Okay. The topics that we cover, as I mentioned, this is mostly a data-related field. So that might be data engineering, data analysts, business intelligence engineer, data scientists, maybe even some sort of solution design person, maybe even software engineering. We cover just sort of algorithms questions as well. But typically it's going to be data-related fields. So that means we do typically do a lot of SQL questions. You've probably noticed that comes up a lot on job descriptions. A lot of Python algorithmic type questions, business and product sense type questions, sort of more high level stuff, statistics, experimental design, probability, machine learning fundamentals and evaluation techniques. And every now and then I like to chuck in some big data, database management. Those questions are a little bit trickier to cover, but we sort of talk about them more on a conceptual level. And then today's topics, first we're going to start with a sort of linear regression 101 question, which I hope will sort of be a bit of guiding discussion. Then we're going to do a SQL question, as we always typically do. And then something a bit new today, we're going to do a data systems design question. Now, in previous sessions, we've spoken about how on job descriptions for data jobs, there's a lot of different services and toolings that they expect you to have knowledge on. So I've been trying to think about how I can introduce that into these sessions, given that there's not usually a question of how do you use this tool. I thought the best way to introduce to some of the AWS services that come up a lot, that you see a lot in job descriptions, would to be cover a data system design question. So this question is mostly designed at getting familiar with a couple, emphasis on a couple because there are so many AWS services, so a couple of AWS services that might be useful to use in a data system design question. So I hope that one will be an interesting one to work on today. I am thinking that I'm going to move my camera because there's a lot of light shifting, so just give me a second. Actually, I don't really have anywhere to put it. Let me try this. Okay, I'll try not to move around. All right, does anybody have any questions at this point before we sort of jump into getting into questions? Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, cool. All right, well, feel free to unmute yourself as you go. And yeah, again, the aim of this group is to be really hands-on, so please participate, don't be shy. The best thing about this group is hearing all the different ways that people are thinking about these problems, so really encourage you to share as much as you can. All right, so today's first question is, like I said, linear regression 101. What are the assumptions of linear regression? Last time we did a problem like this, we went around the room and everyone shared their definition of this. Because it's a bigger group today, I don't think we will do that and go around with everyone, but what I'm thinking is if someone can volunteer to give me one assumption, and if I can get maybe 4 different people giving me at least one assumption, and on top of that, if you can give me an indication of the definition of that assumption and why it matters or how you might detect it. So does anybody want to offer up an assumption of linear regression, just to get us started?
Yeah, can I start?
Yeah, can start. Yeah.
Okay, so assumption in regression. I think there is echo. Is that from my side?
Echo.
I'm hearing my sound.
Yeah, I am also. Nima, I think there might be an echo coming through your there. Are you able to mute yourself there?
Yeah. Okay. I think now it's better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Try again.
Okay. So I can mention some of the assumptions in linear regression. One is the relationship. There is a relationship between dependent and independent variables, or in the other way, between the features and the target variable. And second assumption can be data normality. I mean, data is distributed in a normal distribution. The third one is the independent variables are independent. In the other way, there should not be collinearity, or there should not be a strong relationship between the features or between the independent variables.
Cool, awesome. So you had linearity, normality, sorry, what, and independence, you said?
Yeah, collinearity, no collinearity, yeah.
Okay.
There should not be collinearity. I mean, when you say collinearity, that's a multi-collinearity issue, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one assumption. So there should not be, we have to test that means the independent variable should not have a strong relationship.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Asfadal. So that was 3. Can anyone either expand on those 3 that Asfadal mentioned or think of any others?
I have one other. So this is more basic, but I think like the variables and dependent variables should be continuous, or at least like quantitative.
Right. So, so you're sort of referencing the regression part there, I suppose. So when we're dealing with continuous variables, we're typically dealing with a regression model. Okay. Anything else on the assumptions? Svetlana.
The cases are assumed to be independent. Oh. And I have a echo? Okay, no more. Thank you, Nima. Yeah, so the cases are assumed to be independent. And regarding this normality distribution, it's not necessarily the target is normally distributed. It is the error is normally distributed.
Can you expand on that? Can you expand how you might detect it and why it matters?
No.
May I try?
Anyway, yeah, go for it.
Hello? Hi, do you guys see like from side?
It's a bit of a bad line.
Yeah. Hello? I would try writing.
If you like, Nemo, you can post in the chat because I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So if you want to type in the chat what you're going to say, that'd be great.
Maybe connect through the phone. Sometimes you can connect audio through the phone.
Thanks, Svetlana. Anybody else want to comment on the assumptions of linear regression again? Thinking about this interview scenario, how would you deliver this?
Well, to get to the point about normal distribution of the error, I think we would use residual plots to see if there is an overwhelming, overarching trend in the distribution of the points around that 0 error line, or if there isn't one.
Great, awesome. Cool. And so, does anybody know, let's take the normality assumption. How would you, if this assumption is violated, how might you, what would you do? How could you accommodate for this? or investigate
I
for?
think there are a couple of transformations that you might be able to use, such as the log transform or the box-cox transform.
Awesome. Anything else that maybe you could, as a preliminary verification step, if you notice that it's not normally distributed, anything that you could do to verify your data?
So for our normality check, like mentioned, we could use a residual plot to check whether the errors are constant or not, and to see whether the errors they are around 0 or not, and to see whether there is a pattern between the errors and also the x variable. If there is no pattern, and then the linearity seems okay. And if normality is violated, we could do some transformation on y. And usually we could just do box-cox transformation, and then it will return a lambda value, and to see what we do further.
Awesome.
And we could, for normality check, we could do some tests combining with the residual plot, and tests like I think it's Shapiro test. Yeah, we could do some tests to test the tail, and also to test the what is that? The skewness also.
Yep.
Yeah. And for linearity, linearity, we could do lack of fit test, combining with the plot. And for independence, we could plot the, I think that's autocorrelation. And if it's not good, we could take the difference. We could take the difference or differencing between like YT minus YT minus 1. Yeah.
Do you know, thanks Juan, you touched on it, took my next question, was if we can't do visual tests, what are some other tests that do you know another test that we could do for the independence assumption?
Sorry, not really.
No, that's fine. You touched on the point exactly that I was going to cover. The test I am also thinking of is the Durbin Watson test. Is another popular one for testing the independence assumption. You also mentioned the ones for normality. I was going to ask about those, so thank you for bringing up Shapiro's one. It's also the Jacques Bar. I'm not great at speaking like that. And there's a few more. So I definitely recommend looking up some of the non-visual tests for normality. Anybody want to follow up, clarify, or have anything else to add on the assumptions?
One thing that we haven't, I think I'm echoing here.
Sorry, Robert, try again.
Sure. One thing that we haven't discussed is what loss function is being used. The most typical choice for linear regression is ordinary least squares, which has a nice analytical solution. However, we have a lot of distributions, such as we mentioned with outliers or heavy-tailed distributions, where it might make sense to not actually penalize the squares of the residuals. To get a more robust fit, you might consider another loss function like a mean absolute error or a Huber loss or something.
Really good point. I actually didn't include a note on the loss function. So that's, yeah, thanks, Robert. That's such a good point. Anything else? It's kind of one of those open-ended questions in a way.
Yeah, Lena, I have one question maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it was mentioned that, so my question is, are we testing when when they mention errors, are we testing the data that's distributed normally, or are we testing the errors? When the errors, the residual, right?
Right.
So which one is expected? I mean, supposed to be tested.
Right. So this Svetlana mentioned this earlier, and I think this is actually I'll go to my next slide with the assumptions. This is something that I notice comes up a lot, where with independence and normality, typically you see some sort of explanation like this: observations are independent of each other, but really there's further that you also see residuals need to be independent of each other, and the same with the normality. Assumption is that the residuals of the model are normally distributed. So that's a really good point. Actually, does anyone want to comment on that further? On the normality being the residuals being normal versus the y being normally distributed?
Well, I think a lot of the assumptions for linear regression, they are about the errors. So the normality, we test the normality based on the errors, and the normality of the errors will lead to the normality of y's, because the equation is y equals beta times x, right? So yeah, the errors, the normality in the errors will lead to the normality in y.
Yeah, I was just going to say that for me, when I think about the normality of errors, that's really linked to just linearity in general between the x and the y variable. And so the normality of the errors shouldn't necessarily depend upon where along the distribution, I suppose, the y is chosen. Like the errors should be consistent no matter where you take them from.
Right, that's what we cover in the homoscedasticity point. Like sometimes you'll get a fit where the variance changes a lot as you move. Maybe when you get closer to the outliers of the data, you might have more variance. In that case, you might have heteroscedastic result. But I think the overall point with normality, a nice thing to think about is exactly as you have written here, where it's normal for any fixed value of x. But if you want to talk about the overall distribution of your target variable, that's going to depend on the distributions of x that your data set includes. So if x is normally distributed, I guess you'll get a similar result in y. But if for some reason x is not normally distributed, then the distribution of y will be reflective of that. The full distribution of y not conditioned upon x will not be normal in that case.
Right. That's thanks, Robert, and thanks, Juan, as well. Yeah, I think it's often a flippant thing in these whenever in the resources, as I was following up on these sort of questions, there's almost this underlying assumption that we're talking about the residuals, even though it's not made explicit. So it is important to note what is actually being referred to there. Now, I didn't get any, I didn't add any nice graphs or photos. That I could have included some plots of the homoscedasticity and the normality assumptions, but wasn't that organized. So I did provide you some resources though. Again, in an interview setting, if you get a question like this, or it probably won't be asked directly like this, it'll probably be asked in an open sort of way. But just make sure you are able to understand what they are, but also why they are. Why are they needed? Why are they necessary? How do you verify them? And what can we do if one of these assumptions is violated? So there's a couple of resources here, some articles, some more on some of the tests to check. And this is just obviously a starting point. There's plenty more resources around. So I shared these slides with you so you'll have access to these links. Okay, any follow-up before I move on to the next question?
No, just a question and follow-up to this. So are these from a practical question? So are these validations or are these checks that you do to make sure that your linear model is a good approximation or a good model, or how do you use this in practice?
Yeah, really, really good point, and probably skimmed over that. I guess that's coming into the why. So if your assumptions aren't met, essentially you can't have as much confidence in your results. It essentially means that you're going to get misleading and sometimes worse results. So you need the assumptions to be able to feel essentially confident about your model.
So if these assumptions are not met, then your linear model or linear regressor is not a good model basically for your problem.
Exactly. And like I think Joseph mentioned and Juan mentioned as well, you can do transformations. There are things that you can do if an assumption is in violation. And I think one of these articles, I think it was this second article here, discusses some steps of what you can do if an assumption is violated. But if it is violated, that is cause for further investigation. It might be further investigation into your data cleaning, or it might be further investigation into the model itself.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, well, question 2, we are doing the infamous SQL question, and I guess interview query is becoming a little bit infamous as well in this group. Let's get rid of my cheat sheet. Oh, cool, I just saw it. Thanks, Robert, for sharing that. Okay. All right, so here's the question. I will post the link in the chat. The reason why I like interview queries is because it does have an editor. Try to refrain from looking at the solutions too soon. We'll try and work through it together. So links in the chat if you want to code along with us in the editor. So we have one table, this subscription table. It has a user ID column, a start date column, and an end date column. And given this table of product subscriptions with a subscription start date and end date for each user, we want to write a query that returns true or false whether or not each user has a subscription date range that overlaps with another user's subscription date range. Okay, and they've actually given us an example input and output. So we can see this second user here lies within the first user start date, so we would return true for both of these. The 29th of January is also fitting within this user here, so that would be true, but 4 doesn't. You can see it starts right after user 3, so it would return false because it doesn't overlap in any way. So we want to return a table of trues and false for each user if the subscription overlaps. Any questions so far on clarifying that?
Do we know how big the table is?
We're not. No, we don't. We don't. That is a good follow-up question.
This will crash the server for sure.
Yeah. Let's assume a reasonable sign that we could do. See, I don't want to say because I don't want to give away any of the queries. But let's assume nice vanilla scenario where we're in this ideal world where we don't have to worry about that stuff. So, all right, well, starting off, they've actually given us the output table. So normally the first 2 things I think about when I'm doing a SQL question is, what does my output table look like? What are the columns that I want? And what does a row represent in my output table? So in this case, what that relates to is when you can figure out what your output columns are, that is essentially going to determine your select statement. And once you determine what a row represents, that's going to indicate what your group by statement is going to be, if a group by is necessary. So with that in mind, maybe let's start there. What are the 2 columns that we want to end up with? And in fact, they've given us the user output here.
So you would want to select the user's, the user ID.
Uh-huh. Okay. What's the second column going to be?
I'm a little confused because like when you need to like calculate the overlap or determine it, so I don't.
Right, okay. Yeah, it's a good point. So we don't actually have, it wants us to output an overlap column, but there isn't an overlap column. So that means we're going to have to do something. We're going to have to create this column. So maybe let's just leave that blank and they're aliasing it as overlap. So maybe we'll just pseudocode that for now. What about our group by? If we sort of pseudocode that in, what does a row represent in our output?
Each row is a user.
Right. So we're going to group by
User ID.
User ID. So we can just go group by 1 for user ID. Okay, so that kind of gives us a framework. So now we need to just figure out the logic of how we're going to determine if something's overlapping. So does anyone want to, again, we don't have to do it in SQL syntax. Can we just sort of use plain English to rationale the logic of finding an overlap? What would that mean in this scenario?
You have to compare each user with all the other users until you find an overlap.
Right. Okay. So we need to.
So probably join.
So what are we going to join on in this case, given that we have just one table?
The table with itself.
Right. Okay. So we're going to have a self join. Okay. And then what about the logic? How do we know if dates overlap? Let's say we've got the correct join. We're now comparing two users. What do we need to compare with these dates to be able to return a true value?
We check if any of the dates for one belongs to the interval for the other.
Okay. So
I think, sorry, maybe you could check, like, if you have two intervals, check if the start date for one is before the end date of another. Oh wait, and then you also have to check if it's short enough. I mean, long enough.
Right. So yeah, that's a good point. So let's use a concrete example. We know that 2 overlaps within 1 with 1. So in this scenario, I guess the question I have, does the end date matter? Do we need the end date for the person who we're comparing if it's in? I have a shake of the head from George and a nod of the head from Svetlana. Stand, please.
So if the start date, you have to look at it from the current row's perspective. If my start date is less than another end date, then I know I'm overlapping, regardless of how long my subscription is.
Right. Right, and so I guess this is a good, maybe clarifying question. Is this a problem where they care about the whole interval overlapping, or do they just care about any kind of overlap? For this question, it seems like it's any kind of overlap. So in which case, the start and the end date matters for the one that you're comparing with, but the person who you're trying to find if it's in the interval, you wouldn't need the end date, right? Because we only really need the start date to know, is that start date in the interval? Because even if it's on the last day of the interval, it's still going to be an overlap of some kind.
But maybe the start date was before the interval, but the end date in the interval.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Yeah, good point. Good point. So in this case, we're essentially comparing this start being in, but then if this start was before, but is that accounted for in the flip? Because we're essentially going to compare in both directions.
It
So
seems like it seems like the most efficient way would be to first sort by start date. Then you would only have to check end dates above the row that you're in.
Mm-hmm. True.
Good idea.
Okay. Robert, do you want to try the syntax for that?
I should probably let someone else do that rather than embarrass myself.
I actually hadn't thought about a sorting solution, so I would actually want to think about that syntax myself. I was thinking about a comparison scenario. So what about if we sort, actually, let's think about logic. So one logic is to sort by the start date, and then where for each user we're comparing to see if the end date is that what you said, that the end date and the end date are less than the previous one?
Yeah, what you could do, and I'm thinking about this far more from a Python perspective than a SQL perspective, but you could calculate another column, which is essentially the cumulative max end date of the rows that came before it.
Right.
And you could do that in linear time for the whole column.
Okay. Is that what we said, the cumulative max of the ones before it?
Right, and then you would just have to compare the current start date to the cumulative max of all the ones before it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, I think if you just wanted to sort by the start date, that's just order by start date ascending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think in that scenario, I feel like you would need a CTE, like a subquery of some kind, to sort it first and then extract from that sorted list. Because if you did the query and then in one query and sorted at the end, the sort is sort of going to be the last thing to happen, and we're not going to be able to extract from that. So my assumption is that we're going to need a CTE subquery situation for this solution, which I actually didn't account for. This is why I love this group. Now I've learned a new way.
The third column idea would work, Robert, if you sort by start date. Otherwise, you'd have issues, right?
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking that if you don't sort, the challenge is to avoid an algorithm that scales as n squared. So if you sort first, that's n log n, you can do the rest of the operations in linear time.
No, but if you don't sort and you have the cumulative max, you might have a date that's all the way before anything you've seen so far, where the start and end date. So the start date is less than your cumulative max, but the end date is also less than your cumulative min.
I didn't follow that.
So you're keeping track of your cumulative max, but if you don't sort by start date, you might find, let's say later on, a subscription that started in 2017 and ended in 2017.
Yeah, if you don't sort by the start date, then you're going to have to look at both of those columns. If you sort by start date first, you can subsequently ignore that column.
Right. And that accounts for both types of overlaps, like Svetlana mentioned before, because you sorted by the start date. That's nice. I'm
not sure that you can still ignore it. Because, okay, maybe you have sorted, so you have a certain range for this user, and the previous user started earlier, but we need to check that they finished after we started.
Right.
I mean, I guess I'm making the assumption that for any given row, the end date will always be greater than the start date.
Right.
Right. But if you are comparing this user with the previous user who started earlier, you still need to make sure that there is overlap between them.
Yeah, that's a good point. So essentially, I guess the comparisons we're trying to make is, let's say like your user 1 start has to be less than, or it could be on as well, user 2's end date, and also that user 1's end date is greater than or equal to user 2's start. So we're essentially comparing sort of crosswise.
And actually,
right. And what you've accomplished by sorting is you've guaranteed that the condition in row 15 will always be true. So you only have to check the other condition.
Yeah.
Yeah, like what I'm thinking with the sorting, and I don't know how you do this in SQL, but if you take like the first period of time and like run it down until that's exhausted, then you take the time period where you'd have to like flip sort of the new, because like everything, if you run it down and you're like changing all of them from like true to false as that runs down, as soon as you have the new time period that covers the end date from that first one that you're using, then you could switch to the new time period and like run that down until you hit like the next.
Right. If the first row, if the end date of the first row is equal to the start date of like row 500, then you know that all the rows in between already are true. Is that what you mean, Elena?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting. So I guess I'm trying to now think about how you combine this. You'd still be self-joining, and then your subquery would have to deal with the sorting part. So that we can compare users, how are we going to join the table on itself? I guess we can sort of pseudo that in here. We know we have to do a self join, but how's the join going to look? What type of join, and what are we going to join it on?
It's probably on user ID. User ID. I don't have to do equality though. We have to do maybe less than. So we have to join the table with itself, right? So subscription S1.
What type of join are we thinking?
Inner join?
Why do you say inner join?
You only have one table. No, let's figure this out.
Because you have to join with all the other users, basically.
Yeah, so, I mean, in this case, because you also don't want to double count rows, you actually want to left join in this case to match other users that satisfy our condition, because we'll be joining to the same table but comparing each user to a different user in the table. So
okay.
I don't know if I explain that in the best way. Oops.
Another join you could do is you could do an inner join, but a condition would be that the S1 user ID is less than S2 user ID.
Less than? The user ID is less than?
Yeah. So for every row, you want to look at the rows above you, basically.
So essentially, we're dealing with our on condition.
Don't you then lose some information?
If you sort them, the user IDs will be out of order then, or are we talking about a different approach?
No, yeah, you sort by user ID first. You're right. Then
I think Robert wanted to sort by start date.
we have to pick one, I guess.
So I think for the join, yeah, for the join, we need to actually join it on something, but we can't just do user ID on user ID, because then you're just replicating the table. Essentially, we're trying to like shift it to join on everything.
You are joining on user ID on S1 user ID not equal to S2 user ID.
Right.
And maybe the overlap conditions could be included in the join statement.
Sorry, I missed that last bit.
Maybe in the join, in this line, we could include those.
The conditions?
Yeah, the conditions about overlap.
Right, so yeah, that is one thing to note with on statements. After you're joining, you can join on multiple conditions. So yeah, we could actually just add in our S1 dot start date being less than or equal to our S2 end date, and have another condition of the S1, what do we say? S1 end date being greater than or equal to our S2 start date. So this is actually sort of the solution without the sorting. You can actually just join your table on your conditions that you're looking for with the logic that we sort of spoke about earlier. The only thing we're missing is then how do we actually return trues and falses here? So we haven't actually defined what our overlap is going to be. So once we've joined it and we have these conditions, we now need to pull out, we either want to return 1 or true if it is within an overlap, if it does meet this condition, and if it doesn't, it's not going to get joined. So you're going to have a row that is a row that is essentially null for that person, which is then indicating a 0 or that it's false. They didn't meet these conditions. So is anyone familiar with what if statements look like in SQL? Sveta, are you trying to say something? Okay.
Is it like case?
Yeah.
Is it case?
It is, exactly. So in fact, it's a case when. And the flow is case, when, end. So they're essentially the key words. So you have case, when, and then I always like to put the end at the end because I always forget the end. So then we have the condition and then we end it. So case when, what's the case going to be?
The count.
So essentially we can think about, we want to compare, if we're selecting, let's say we're selecting the first user ID, and then we want to take from the second table, the S2 table, we want to compare that with the S1 table. So when
S2, count of S2 user ID.
Yep. What do we need to check? When the user ID in the second table, if it meets the condition, then that means it's going to have something in it.
So when count of S2 user ID is greater than 0?
Do we need a count?
No.
Because in this case, when we do the join of these tables, it's either going to have something in it or it's going to be null. And if it has something in it, that means that it has overlapped because it's met the conditions. We've determined the conditions of what an overlap looks like. So once this joins, if these conditions are met, then every single row is either going to have null, meaning that the condition wasn't met, or it's going to have something in it. It's going to have a valid value. So in this case, we're just checking if it's not null. Because if it's not null,
okay,
we can put 1 or true. Otherwise, if it is null, that means that there wasn't an overlap in that join, in that joining statement. So we can return false.
So what happens when this query has a row in S1 that matches multiple rows in S2?
Right. A row in S1 has multiple rows that match in S2. Is that what you said?
Right.
Right. So you're gonna have
Suppose that one of your rows overlaps with multiple other users' subscription dates.
Right. So this scenario here is essentially like you say. So essentially we're getting a table where it's going to have something in it or it's not. So this query actually isn't finished right now because you make the point of there could be multiple, there could be more than that you're matching with. So then if they're all null, then you're going to return false all the time. But if that one row is null, 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 and it has just one, then we want to return true, even if it is only matched with one that is true. So in this case, in SQL, there's actually this, you can just wrap it in a max function, and it's just going to take all those scenarios, and it's either going to return null, or it's going to return a cumulative number, which the max is going to be essentially the one, which is going to be our true scenario. I don't know if that spoke to what you were asking, but I think that was sort of alluding to.
Yeah, I was just concerned that you might get back lots of rows, but I think so that you would need an aggregator to treat that. I mean, essentially what you want is return true if any row has something.
Right.
Right. And this looks like it would do that.
Right. And so the max, I'm pretty sure this is going to work on true. I'm pretty sure it's the same as Python where it's just going to evaluate to 1 and 0. But in this case, that means that it's going to take that value and return that each time for all of those subsequent. And then we have a group by so that we are just going to get one row per user. Let's see if maybe these need to be ones here. What's happened here?
This is just a guess. Is it like case 1 when S2 user ID is not null, else 0? I have no idea.
3. Oh, I don't have a then. Sorry. I need a then in here. Oh, sorry. Then. Sorry. Oh, what now? End statement. This one.
Yeah, the issue is indicated on the on condition. Yes.
So the column.
Do you need a comma after S2?
Yeah, you don't need a column before on.
Oh, thank you.
Subscription S2.
Yeah?
No.
Oh, no. Sorry.
No, you don't need commas.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes, commas. Get rid of the previous comma as well.
Right. Thank you. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Right. So it's sorted by the overlap column.
Yeah. Check the first 4. Oh yeah. So instead of 1, 0, I think you can use true or false.
Yeah. Cool. So essentially, I mean, what's kind of annoying about interview queries, you don't get to see what your test data is, so we can't sort of verify if this is true. But I'd like to, we've actually spent quite a lot of time on this one, so we might move on to the next one. But yeah, I am really interested to try the sorting question. So let's keep chatting over Slack about this one. to see if we can come up with what the syntax would be of that. Lost my mouse. All right, well, any questions before we do move on? Sorry, I did spend a little bit too much time on this one. Questions on that? Okay, well, I suggested something here that we sort of went over. There's a second one there. All right, so we did talk about self-joins, talking about how do you determine your logic, how do you figure out what your output columns, rows are going to be. That's sort of just some strategy in approaching the questions. And then obviously your logic is going to determine your syntax from there. Because we've done so many SQL questions in the past, refer to the resources we've sort of touched on earlier. But also I recently got this cookbook, this O'Reilly SQL cookbook, which has been kind of helpful when doing questions because you can just look up, like this question, it was, there's a whole chapter on overlapping date ranges. And so it's a good just pull out, look up the index on whatever the style of the problem is, and it's really helpful just to be able to boost your general knowledge. So recommend that cookbook. I have found it useful. Cool. All right, so let's move on to this sort of data system design one. Again, this is a little more of a discussion question and to be exposed to some new tools and services. But here's a scenario that we can think about it. Okay, you work as a data professional at a company with a call center. The non-technical employees in this call center take down customer data and notes which are stored locally on their computers. The company would like to be able to unify this data into a central data lake so that they can query this data. Okay, just sort of a nice one-on-one problem. You're tasked with building or designing a system to get this data from the call center employees to a data lake. How would you do this? It's a nice open-ended question. There's a couple ways we can do this today. One, we can try and just figure it out from scratch on our own, or if you're not familiar with these styles of questions, I have provided some slides that we could use as a guided discussion to guide sort of how we might step through this question. So a couple of options there of how we can work through this. To start with though, let's think about clarifying questions. Do we understand this question? What are the questions we need to know about this to dig deeper on this? I'll also give you a second.
Finally, a practical question.
Yeah, take a couple of minutes just to read it again and digest.
Clarification question. Yeah, do they have the IT system? Do they need the complete solution, or are they looking only for the data solution? Or for example, do they have a existing VPC and like that?
Do they have an existing system in place? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Do they need from the scratch? I mean, what kind of solution do they need, or only specific to?
Yeah, I want you to picture this like they're about to adopt a system that will streamline this process, but we have some legacy data on physical laptops of these non-technical people that we need to get over into our data lake. So we're assuming we need to figure out how to get this data, and then after that point, there will be a system, potentially the one we design, that will streamline this. So if we want to narrow down this problem, we're going to specifically deal with the case of how do we get it from the local computers of the employees to the data lake.
Maybe we need to ask how many employees there are and how often they want this data to be collected from the local computers to the system, and how much data there is.
Yeah, let's assume for this problem, let's say there are 100 call center employees, and just imagining like they're sitting in a call room and they're taking down notes while they're on the call. They're putting in, first name, last name, address, that kind of data. So there's some unstructured data, some structured data. It's kind of a mix, and it's just being stored on their local computer. Let's say there's 100 employees, and so there's a variety of files maybe there's CSV files for that structured data, and then the more unstructured notes data. So sort of a variety.
Should we assume that each employee is using the same format for this data?
Maybe, maybe not. I think we could assume that there could be, I think what we can say is that it's either going to be notes data or it's going to be structured, but the formatting within that, there could be errors, mistakes, and entered incorrectly. And so we want, I guess one thing to clarify as well is that we want the employees to, it's on their local computer, so they obviously have to be involved in how this data is getting transported if it's on their computers. Anything else about the clarified?
Yeah. Can I forward my idea maybe? There is no question on the clarification side.
Okay, did you say you have an idea?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if there is no any clarification questions at all.
Yeah, Asfeta, if no one else, I'm happy for Asfeta to share what you're thinking.
I think one clarifying question would be, is there anything that is definitely present for a specific customer, like name and address? Because like name, sometimes there's multiple people with the name, but like, is there any way to like uniquely identify a specific person? Because like speaking from my own experience, I had like a bunch of headaches before where like there would be two people with the same name and I had to ask, hey, are you in fact this person? Or maybe email, except people can have like different emails too.
Right.
Anyway.
Okay, so for the scope of this question, let's say we don't really know much about the data. So we, name and last name might just be an example of the type of data they're collecting, but we don't know too much about it. We essentially just want to build a system to get it from A to B, and there's probably just a hint, there's probably going to be some sort of processing and cleaning involved in that. So I mean, we could probably make some safe assumptions that there are going to be IDs attached to the data as they're taking calls, taking down data, that there is some sort of log system, ID system in how this data is being curated. So maybe we can make that assumption that it does have some sort of ID. But that might be something that we take into consideration while we build our system. Asfeta, do you want to share what you were thinking?
Yeah, I think in this case, what we'll consider the first stage is the hardware sizing, right? The hardware sizing comes from the assumption how many employees are supposed to use the system and so on. So in hardware sizing, when I say how many storage do we need, servers or is database required, and so on. So that is the first stage, I think. Mm-hmm. So because we are thinking when we say in a cloud infrastructure, so we are looking what kind of resource do we need to run our data services.
Right.
So the data service is depend on the hardware side. So that's what I'm saying, the sizing. So sizing, okay. So because that affects the operational. If we don't have enough resource, for example, right, the data service will be totally affected.
Right.
And definitely the next layer is the application. Here, call center is definitely they are planning to use a shared services. It can be like Thinkland and so on. So that means there is a server and everyone, they don't need computer, but they need only access to the centralized server.
Right.
So that's the thing for the server side. And so I think in this way, the call center, like you said, if they have a local server, so to move to the cloud, so what they need is a shared resources. Mm-hmm. And instead of having individual IAM, now what we have to plan is now there will be a server which is only accessing the VPC, the virtual call center.
Yep.
So the virtual call center and so on. So they need only one IAM, which is share the servers. So the IAM may be admin, the IT admin, mm-hmm. but the data service can be, I think, operationalized in this way.
Awesome. Does anybody have any questions for Asvedal on his sort of solution there? I think that was, thanks for being so thorough. So I guess two things that you pointed out. One is that size aspect that's going to determine that's going to determine the hardware, how we're actually storing this, what services are we going to use, what's appropriate for this scenario. And then you mentioned the application side of it. So we do have these two components. How are we actually getting through? And like you said, the call center people are non-technical. How are they accessing it? And you mentioned the IMA roles. Cool. Awesome.
I think the third one, the security side as well.
The what?
So the security configuration, the inbounding, outbound configuration.
Yep.
So that will be considered, because those IPs should be the IP where the call center people are, the agents are located.
Yep.
So the security configuration also, has to be configured accordingly.
Do you have any services specifically in mind that you would use or think of in that scenario, or that you have used?
Yeah, what do you mean service, like the S3, like the clouds? Are you looking for are you asking the cloud services?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't have in my mind, but it should be, definitely this is a matured service in the market. Call center is everywhere, so
yeah.
Any kind of application which is designed for call center can be used. I mean, even you can use your own, if they have their own call center application, even they can install on the EC2, for instance. If we are considering AWS, what they need is only the server.
Right.
So they can install their applications on the cloud infrastructure. So what they need is only the server.
Right.
Or in the other way, we can look also different. Maybe, I guess there will be, this is a mature service, so there will be services like AWS and other services in the cloud provider.
Awesome. Cool. And I just asked because we will touch on it, so hoping you would say some things that might preface what we'll talk about. Awesome. And does anybody want to follow up on any of that before? I'll sort of take you through my slides as well, and we'll go through it together. But Asvedal
so
is
one main,
set us up.
Yeah, one main thing you need to ask is this done? Is this a one-time thing? Are you migrating to the cloud, your existing infrastructure, or for whatever reason you want to maintain the existing taking notes approach locally and then uploading them to the system, which is not efficient at all? Like that's so are you doing a migration, or are you doing are you rebuilding the system to support your existing process?
Yeah, right. Great. So that's, definitely a good clarification. So for the scope of this problem, and again, of course, it's a little bit contrived in the example case, but we're assuming that we are migrating to a new system that's going to be built, and we have to get the old legacy data from the old way it was done, essentially from local to that. So it's going to be essentially a one-off migration from this local data. Once all of this, let's say there's 100 employees and they have, I don't know, let's say they have 0.5 terabyte of data each or something. Once all of that is moved, then that's it. And the new system is in place and more efficient and ongoing.
Then you have to train your users in your new system, right? And use new processes and move forward.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we're essentially trying to deal with that legacy data that offlow. So assuming from this certain date, we need to get all the data from before this new start date of this new system. So it's a little bit contrived, but yeah, we're trying to address, yeah, essentially getting that local data to a cloud data lake.
Cool.
Cool. All right, well, time is moving very quickly today, so I'll walk through sort of my suggested framework. Again, it's a suggestion, so there's multiple ways that you can approach these sorts of problems. So this is just a suggestion and one framework that you could use, and I'll touch on some specific services that you can use as well that Sveta mentioned as well. So thinking about our basic problem, we're essentially trying to get from A to B. It's an A to B problem. We have some data on a local computer of the employee, and we want to get it to some cloud data lake destination. So we essentially need to fill in the blanks of this arrow, what actually happens between there. Unfortunately, we can't just get a USB drive and plug it in our computer and then plug it in the data lake, unfortunately. So let's think about this stream. So one key part of this problem was that we have non-technical employees. So that probably means they're not familiar with command line tools or how to use APIs or SDKs and that kind of thing. So we need to give them some sort of user-friendly management console to be able to upload their data somehow into the cloud. One option, and this isn't the only option, but one option is to have perhaps a web page, some sort of user interface for the employees to simply upload their data to that web page, to that service. And then that web page will put it into the data lake. Then the USB can go and put it in. So now we need to figure out this question mark. How do we get it from the web page, the interface that they're interacting with, the employees are interacting with, and get it to our actual data lake? So a few of you touched on this, the fact of that we don't know how this data is currently formatted or processed, what's coming in. So before we just stick it in our data lake, we want something to be done to it. It might be as simple as clearing out some white spaces, or it could be more advanced where we only want certain files. Maybe we only want zip files and CSVs to be allowed into the data lake. So we would reject if they tried to upload a JPEG or a JSON or something different. So there might be some sort of conditioning here, some rules. What do we do and do not want to allow into our data lake? So this step here can be really small rules, or it can be quite extensive rules. So we need to have some sort of data processing in this scenario. So in a very, again, keyword on basic framework, this is essentially your end-to-end flow. We need something for the users to interact with, and then we need, once it's uploaded, we need some sort of processing, some sort of actions to happen before it is then shipped into our data lake where it's going to sit. So then if we speak a little more specifically on tooling, again, I should have prefaced that I'm really not good at making graphs and making these kinds of diagrams, so deal with my 5-year-old presentation. But as Sveta made mention of S3 bucket, so an AWS S3 bucket, you can think of it like your Finder on your Mac. It is a storage system. The S3 stands for Simple Storage Solution. It can contain a variety of objects. You can think of it like a dumping ground. You could have it just like your desktop computer where you have all sorts of files, JPEGs, PDFs, you know what a messy desktop looks like, or you can have it organized and structured and have some sort of schema related to it. Okay, but really you can stick anything into it in a nutshell. So we could put our HTML file and have that hosted on an S3 bucket. And in this scenario, because it's a one-off use, there's only, let's say, 100 employees, you could have your web page hosted on EC2 instance, but EC2 instances are really expensive if they're running all the time. And so if it's a one-off usage and it doesn't need to be frequently accessed, then an S3 bucket's probably enough for that use case. The service that you can use for pre-processing data is AWS Lambda, which is essentially one-off functionality, or you can have complex scripts as well, but it allows you to run this, and it's serverless as well. So you can get your HTML to ship through to AWS Lambda. it'll do all your pre-processing of your data, and then our data lake might be another S3 bucket. Again, it could be something else, but let's say the good thing about S3 is that we can have lots of different data types in there, objects in there. So your data lake might be another S3 bucket. And the other good thing about S3 buckets is they're highly scalable. You can scale them according to your needs really easily. So I have a question mark here, and it's sort of something that Asfetal mentioned. What would sort of be the problem of just getting our web page to go straight to our pre-processing and into our data lake? What's sort of the issue with this step here? I guess the naive simplicity of it.
Two issues I see. One is, since you don't know what you're accepting, you might actually break your Lambda. I don't know how well your Lambda is written, what kind of edge scenarios it accepts.
Right.
The other issue is you might actually upload the same file twice, or you can update the same nodes twice or multiple times by different employees.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so the employees part, so I guess this is a web page. It's just a HTML web page. So as Fedel mentioned, the fact of like security, we don't just want anyone to be able to upload any old data. We only want these employees with these roles to be able to put it in there as well. So a couple more services that we can look at is Amazon Route 53 is just Amazon's DNS domain name server. So we can get it to take our S3, our HTML file, and within that direct it to an API gateway. And Amazon has an API gateway as well. And this is where we can implement all of our security. Where are we going to route things? Do you have the right permissions? Get access codes and that kind of thing. So this API gateway is actually going to be the more appropriate route to take to make sure that we're not just shipping anything onto AWS Lambda and processing data that isn't even a part of our company, for example. So that is, again, this is a very sort of simplified version of, but just to sort of get an idea of the flow in this design. One really nice thing I thought I would mention as well about data lake in S3 is that you can use Amazon Athena to use SQL style querying of it, and it can query big data, really big large sets of data, and it is, yeah, so I just wanted to mention that with the S3 because Athena is another good resource to check out as far as actually being able to query the data once it's in our data lake. So Asfetal, just because you gave that solution earlier, do you have anything that you would extend on this, or how you might, some follow-ons to this structure?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I would like to ask on the Lambda, what do you think, when it will be triggered? Because the Lambda needs a trigger, right?
It needs what, sorry?
Trigger, that's the thing. Yeah, it needs a trigger, right?
Yep.
So the pre-processing, for example, we can think during the data migration, because what we are thinking is now a centralized data governance, right? Data platform. So every user, so maybe the Lambda, I'm thinking the Lambda might need only on the migration process when we move the user's data. When we come to the operational side, yeah, I'm not looking the importance of Lambda, because the pre-processing is now to define a common data requirement, right? Data format or the parameters.
Yep.
So, but during the operation, maybe it might not, the Lambda might not be needed, because what we need a Lambda is that's maybe a script, can be Python program or a class.
Yep.
So the objective is to pre-process, and so after pre-processing in operational side, the call center agents they are just accessing the pre-processed data.
Right. Right.
So the pre-processing stage is maybe I'm looking that might be required only on the migration side, but the other solution is fine to me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. So essentially, just summarizing from that, you would be treating this data lake as your raw data lake that needs pre-processing, and your Lambda is doing essentially your allow and block listing stuff. Like because like you said, it needs that trigger. Is this even allowed to go through the rest of the funnel? So it's almost like your gatekeeper as well. Yeah, that's a good distinction. Yeah, thanks. That's a good point.
Another way to group this Route 53 and API gateway is just have just create an account for each user and have the web page stored needing a username and password to access it. So it's a secure website. Yep. So that way only authenticated users can access the website, and then in the back end, the website can directly interact with your Lambda and your data lake.
Awesome. And do you think, and so they're interacting through like the interface, like the console again?
It will be a website, but the website, when you log in, it will ask you for credentials.
Yep.
And based on username and password, you'd have different permissions for different users. I mean, right now, basically everybody would have an upload permission or a read-write permission to your data, but later on you can make it more fine-grained.
Yep.
And in terms of the Athena here, so that's what you use to actually query the data, but don't think that you can just put anything you want in S3. It has to be a little bit structured. It has to be like a CSV, JSON, text. It has to have some kind of a structure. It cannot just be handwritten notes.
Yeah, it does. So this is where I would, you can get Lambda to define your schema for your S3 as well. So, I mean, you could have multiple insertions of Lambda for all these different use cases. And you can also use Lambda to enforce a schema structure so that it can be queried by Athena. So yeah, like you said, because it is a SQL querying. So yeah, like you say, you couldn't just have random.
That's then in terms of like cost and timeline, that's most of your development time and cost will be spent in that pre-processing and figuring out how much effort you need to put. It starts with what kind of questions you want to ask. So you need to think of what questions you want to ask now, as well as what question you want to ask, a year from now.
Right.
And then you need to create those metrics in the pre-processing step so that they can be ingested in the data lake.
Right.
So your business requirement needs to define your technical pre-processing step here.
Yep. Yep. Awesome. Yeah, thanks.
Someone asked in the chat, what is IM? I also have that question because I don't remember when you mentioned it.
Yeah, that's the identity and access management. Basically, in AWS, every user needs an account, which is that's part of authentication. So, like we said, username, password in email, and other thing. So, in a cloud infrastructure, you have to define users, and you will have also root users. That's good. Anyway, IAM stands for identity and access management. So let's define.
Yeah, I have seen that before. Okay, cool.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing those resources in the chat too. Okay, cool. Well, we're kind of at time today, but again, the reason for this was mostly to expose to a couple of services, because we've had discussions in the past about all different toolings and services that have been mentioned. So I think they can sound a little abstract at first. So I just wanted to try and find a way to bring some context around some of these services and tools. So I've got links to these, which you can get off this presentation when I posted in the Slack. AWS has a lot of resources, and George just mentioned their conference has already started, which I think is a 3-week event. It's pretty insane, and the lineup is overwhelming to say the least. But there's plenty of every single service, almost every single service on AWS has a cute little video graphic explaining how the service, it's usually a 2 or 3 minute video. So if you're unfamiliar, if you see something on a job description or something here, typically you can just type in AWS Lambda and it'll give you a little video graphic on what it is and how to use it. So I think it's good to be familiar with these resources to some degree. Some might not use them at all. Maybe data engineers much more so than strictly data scientists. But yeah, I'm glad I was able to fit it in somehow to talk about this kind of stuff. So happy exploring with that, and would love to sort of continue chats in the Slack channel about this kind of stuff. But yeah, that's all I have for questions today. Thanks for working them through with me. It was really cool to hear some of your thoughts. I want to follow up on the alternative solution on the SQL question and keep chatting about AWS stuff in the Slack. And then, yeah, you're welcome to stick around for a chat if you want. We can follow up on other questions, or we can call it a day.
Just out of my curiosity, can you change the slide to the second solution?
Yes,